So this is actually a lecture 11, not lecture 12. I was miscounting, and I'm going to be lazy and just write it in like that. So lecture 11, muscle physiology 2. In this lecture, we will be covering how whole muscle contraction occurs, where the energy for muscle contraction comes from, some of the ways that you can vary the amount of force generated by muscle contraction, look at how velocity and duration of muscle contraction are impacted by various factors, and also how exercise improves or changes our muscle physiology. And per request, I will put a little star, meaning I am now done with this slide. So to start out today's lecture, we're going to first talk about whole muscle contraction. And what we mean by whole muscle contraction is what happens when a muscle, the entire muscle contracts. So this is muscle with all of its fascicles bundled together by the epimysium. So this is as opposed to a single muscle contraction, which is what we looked at last time when we were talking about contraction, excitation, contraction, coupling, and all of that process. So the first step process that I'd like to define is that what whole muscle contraction accomplishes, the contraction produces muscle tension. Which then results in force being exerted on a load or object that's being moved. And just for those of you that are, all of you, this is Lou Ferrigno, who was the original Incredible Hulk in the 1970s TV show. And that is not any CGI. To start out with, we will be talking about a muscle twitch, which is the artificial event of a single muscle fiber twitching or contracting by itself. A muscle twitch is something that is not physiological, but is the response of a motor unit to a single action potential. Motor unit to a single action potential. And I think I defined this earlier, but just in case not, a motor unit is one motor neuron plus all the muscle fibers that it innervates. And I'll just say stimulates. A muscle twitch takes place in 3 distinct phases. The first phase is called the latent period, and this is the period that is needed for excitation, contraction, coupling to occur. So excitation, contraction, coupling. And if you remember from the last topic, last lecture, during this phase, you're not actually you've not actually activated muscle contraction, but you're just sort of getting that process started. And so down here, you can see the latent period is that sort of roughly 5 millisecond period in which no force is being generated, even though the stimulus was added at time 0. The second period of a muscle twitch is called the period of contraction, and this is when the cross-bridge cycle is active. And during this phase, the muscle is generating tension. And during a certain type of contraction, this is the period when the muscle will actually contract or shorten. It is not always the case, because muscles can actually be pulled apart even though they're generating force. And so here on this graph, I'll change color and pen. You can see the period of contraction is from about 5 milliseconds to roughly 30 milliseconds. And then the third phase is called the period of relaxation. And the muscle returns to its resting state. this is actually the longest period of a muscle twitch. And during this phase, so going from here all the way out to 130-ish milliseconds, this is the phase where the cross-bridge cycle is turned off, actin is pulled out of the synaptic cleft, and basically contraction stops. So now that we've talked through the basic mechanism of a muscle twitch, which is how muscles fundamentally generate force, we're going to now cover how we generate various amounts of force using muscles, because our muscles are just not all or nothing structures. So as I mentioned earlier, muscle twitches are only visible in lab settings because typically you don't get a single stimulus coming in and activating a motor unit, but there's going to be multiple stimulus coming on top of each other. So it's useful for understanding muscle physiology, but is not terribly relevant to human physiology. And this is also illustrated by the fact that when our muscles contract, we have a fairly smooth increase and then decrease of muscle tension across the muscles. So we need to be able to understand how does that happen. Graded muscle responses are required for normal human activity. So we need to be able to use the same muscle groups to generate very little amount of force when we have fine motion, such as picking up something very delicate, like maybe a newborn baby or a piece of sort of very delicate glasswork or something like that. And then the same muscle groups need to be able to generate the maximum amount of force that they can if you're lifting a very heavy object. So we need to understand how is the same muscle group able to do that. And to generate graded amounts of force, there's two general mechanisms. So you can change the strength of the stimulation to the muscle, which we will talk about in a second, or you can also change the frequency at which that stimulation is coming. So one of the key impacts of altering the strength of stimulus is that it alters the number and size of motor units activated. So it alters number and size of motor units. And this then allows us to generate a varied amount of contractile force. And as you would probably predict, as stimulus increases, so if you get increased stimulus equals increased force of contraction. And these graphs on the right-hand side of the image illustrate this. So in the top graph, this is showing stimulus strength. So as stimulus strength gets higher and higher, the red arrow is getting higher and higher. You can see at subthreshold, now in the middle table, which is showing a cross-section of a muscle fiber, you can see subthreshold, there's no muscle fibers being activated. By stimulus strength 3, you've suddenly hit threshold and you get a couple of muscle fibers being activated. As the stimulus goes higher and higher, you're then going to get more and more motor units being recruited. So here's more and more motor units being recruited up to the point where even though the stimulus is now going higher, because down in this middle one, all of the motor units are now active, this generates the maximum amount of force contracted. So it's basically subthreshold, increasing stimulus that then recruits more and more motor units, then all the motor units get activated and no more force is being generated. The size principle says that as stimulus increases, so increased stimulus, it's going to lead to increased size of muscle fiber recruited. So what this gives us is less power when there's a smaller stimulus, so it gives you sort of more fine control. And then as the stimulus gets ramped up, you're going to get these larger muscle fibers, as indicated by this huge thick muscle fiber, and that will generate more tension. But because there's a gradation of starting with a weak stimulus to going to a higher stimulus, this will actually also help with the smoothing of muscle contraction. So you generate less force and then gradually increase more and more force, rather than not all of a sudden increase generating a lot of force. A second mechanism that underlies changes in strength and muscle response is called wave summation. And wave summation takes into account changes in frequency of stimulation. So to illustrate this principle, we'll start out with a single stimulus. So one stimulus here will result in a single contractile response. Contractile response. So on this graph, you can see a stimulus comes in. Here, you get the contraction, tension increases, relaxation, and you're back to baseline. So what happens in wave summation is you get two or more stimuli received by a muscle or motor unit in rapid succession. 2 plus stimuli received by motor unit in rapid succession. And so here you can see the motor unit gets stimulated, generates tension, starts to relax, and before it's relaxed again fully, it gets stimulated again, causing another generation of force, contraction, generates more force now, relaxes, still doesn't hit full relaxation before another stimulus hits, and so you can see this increase in tension generating. So muscles don't relax between stimulus. So muscle fibers don't have time to relax between stimuli. And so with each stimulus, you get a stronger, greater tension being generated. What is also happening within the cell physiologically is that there's getting to be more and more intracellular calcium. So more and more calcium concentration with each stimulus, which in turn prolongs the contraction, so that more and more force gets generated. And what this really results is a smooth, continuous contractions that have added up. Or add on top of each other, which is why it's called summation. If we further increase the frequency of stimulation beyond what we saw in the last slide, you get a sustained quivering contraction. So this is increased frequency of stimulation. And what this is called is unfused tetanus. It's also called incomplete tetanus. The reason it's called incomplete or unfused tetanus is there's a little bit of relaxation between each of these peaks. So if there was no relaxation, that would be fused tetanus, which we will see in the next slide. So if the stimulus frequency is increased even further, So the stimulus is coming so fast, there's absolutely no time for relaxation. Muscle tension will max out. So rapid stimuli. So muscle fibers don't relax. So then that's going to give us the maximum tension that muscle can generate. Which is going to be called fused or complete tetanus. And so why it's called the fused or complete tetanus is the contractions fuse into one smooth, sustained contraction plateau. This is also not terribly relevant physiologically. So not physiologically relevant. Just because it's very seldom that we actually generate the maximum amount of force. You can potentially do it, and pathologically it can happen if you get infected with the bacteria that gives us the infection called tetanus. But in most everyday living, you don't actually generate maximum force with your muscles. If you continue a muscle contraction for a long time, which you can see illustrated here, where we have high frequency of stimulation, different frequencies. So here's low frequency where we're seeing no fatigue. Higher frequency where you can see after a period of time you're getting this fatigue. And then with tetanus you hit fatigue faster, and the second peak is just showing that it takes a while to recover from fatigue. So prolonged muscles contraction, prolonged contractions leads to fatigue, which should also be something familiar to all of you. And we will talk about muscle fatigue more in a few minutes. The next thing we're going to talk about, just as terms of definitions, is what is muscle tone. Muscle tone is defined as the state of slight contraction that all skeletal muscles normally maintain. So slight, constant, low-level contraction. And so normally if somebody is not ill or not in a certain state of sleep, you always have some skeletal muscle tone. This is maintained by spinal reflexes that stimulate the motor units in the muscle to alternately contract and relax, keeping some tension generated. So what this does is keeps muscles firm, healthy, and ready to respond to a stimulus from the brain. And so these two pictures are just illustrating muscle tone. So this gentleman on the left is illustrating muscle tone in terms of actually very unusual for somebody that looks like the age that he is. And then something that happens with newborns is they can actually lose all muscle tone when they're sleeping. And so this is illustrating that. I'd now like to introduce you to a couple more terms that are used to describe muscle contraction. So isotonic and isometric contractions. Isotonic contractions are defined as those in which the muscle changes length as it moves a load. So length changes as load moves. And there's two different varieties of isotonic contraction. So you have concentric contractions in which the muscle shortens as it generates force or conducts work. Which is what you would normally think of, like when you're picking something up, you are having a concentric contraction to lift that heavy item up. Eccentric contractions, on the other hand, are ones where the muscle lengthens as it generates force. So the way to think of an eccentric contraction is one that's resisting elongation, because muscle force is only generated in the contractile direction, so shortening direction. So if a muscle is being pulled longer, an eccentric contraction means that that muscle is resisting the pulling of longer. So you would use this if you're putting that heavy item now down. So you're basically lowering it gently to the floor. You're using an eccentric contraction for that sort of force generation. The other type of contraction that our bodies produce are called isometric contractions. Isometric contractions are one in which the load is greater than the maximum tension that can be generated. Load greater than tension. And so there's no movement. And when this happens, muscle is generating tension, but it is not shortening and it's not lengthening. So if you were to try and pick up something that was too heavy, so say you had a 1,000 pound block of cement you wanted to pick up, and you went and tried to lift it with as much force as you could, you would generate tension, the block would not move, and because the block is not moving, your muscles are not shortening, so it would then be defined as an isometric contraction. These can also be postural contractions in which you're holding your body steady and basically using antagonistic muscle groups to act against each other to hold the body in place and not move. The next topic we're going to cover is where does the energy come from that is needed for muscle contractions. So what I'd like you to do now is, before going on to the next slide, answer the following question. What 3 activities during muscle contraction require ATP? So to remind you, and hopefully you've now answered these questions, the 3 steps that require ATP are to cock the myosin head and also detach actin from myosin. So I'm calling that one effect because basically it is still the same ATP molecule. Another step that requires ATP is pumping calcium back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Back into SR. So this is at the end of the contraction. Sorry if there's a little blip there. I was having trouble with my microphone getting muted. So third step is creating the resting membrane potential. So the sodium-potassium pump. So the sodium-potassium pump is used to maintain the resting membrane potential. So maintain the sodium and potassium gradient. Which the cell uses to create the resting membrane potential. So the RMP for resting membrane potential, which is then needed for action potential, which our cells are dependent on for excitation-contraction coupling. So in our muscle fibers, the amount of ATP that's normally available is only enough ATP to provide about 4 to 6 seconds of energy. And just as a reminder, ATP is the only source of energy for contractile activities. So you can't use glucose directly. And because of this, to be able to contract beyond about 4 to 6 seconds, we must have a mechanism to regenerate. So must regenerate ATP quickly for longer contractions. The three ways in which ATP can be generated in cells, going in order of speed, are direct phosphorylation, which will regenerate it the fastest, anaerobic pathways, which are relatively quick but do not go as quickly as direct phosphorylation, and finally aerobic respiration, which is the slowest. Direct phosphorylation is the process by which ATP is donated a phosphate group from another molecule. And in our muscle fibers, direct phosphorylation is carried out by the molecule creatine phosphate. So, which then donates phosphate to ADP. So adenosine diphosphate, which is the dephosphorylated version of adenosine triphosphate. The enzyme that's responsible for this is creatine kinase. So creatine kinase catalyzes that reaction. So if we were to draw this out as a reaction, here you can see creatine phosphate, adenosine phosphate come in as a reaction. It's catalyzed by creatine phosphate, which again is an enzyme, meaning that it speeds up a reaction but does not get changed by the reaction, and that will transfer this phosphate group over to the ADP, leaving creatine and ATP as the products. And muscle fibers typically have about 15 seconds of creatine phosphate available. So basically you could survive a 100-yard sprint. Beyond that, you sort of run out of the ability to do direct phosphorylation. The second pathway of generating ATP is called anaerobic respiration. And what anaerobic respiration does is transfer the energy, potential chemical energy from glucose into the generation of ATP. And so it does this through a process of glycolysis. So glycolysis is the first step in all glucose breakdown. So first step in glucose metabolism. And some of the advantages of glycolysis is that it does not require oxygen, so no O2 needed. And for every sugar molecule, every glucose molecule that you break down, you get 2 ATP. So what happens during high-intensity workouts, such as the 100-meter dash, which this is one of my favorite pictures of Usain Bolt in the 100-meter dash, both showing how much taller he is than everybody else, but just the fact that he can look at the camera and smile as he's a full body length out and ahead of everybody else. But what happens that blocks muscles from getting oxygen during intense exercise is that the bulging muscles compress blood vessels. So blood vessels compressed by muscles. And so then oxygen delivery can't occur, and so then glycolysis is the only source of ATP. An advantage of glycolysis during high-intensity activities is that they're very fast, and they can generate ATP 2.5 times faster than aerobic pathways. But the disadvantage is that they only yield about 5%, so they're very inefficient. 5% of ATP is generated. So 5% of ATP is generated per glucose molecule in aerobic respiration. And so to illustrate this, I show a picture of a dragster, which is a car that can accelerate incredibly fast, but it does not do it terribly efficiently. The last mode of generating energy for contraction is aerobic respiration. And this is the source of about 95% of the ATP that is generated when we're at rest or when we are exercising lightly or moderately. And some disadvantages of it is that it is much slower, so again 2.5 times as slow as anaerobic pathways. It requires oxygen, so if your muscles are bulging up and blocking blood vessel supply to the tissue, you won't be able to do it. But the advantage is that it is much more efficient, and instead of only 2 ATP, you can actually generate about 32 ATP per glucose molecule. So the fuels that are used during aerobic respiration are partly the glucose from glycogen breakdown. So muscles are fairly rich in glycogen, and so glycogen being a polymer or polysaccharide made up of glucose molecules, you break it down and get glucose. You can also have glucose diffusing in from the blood. So glucose from blood. And finally, you can also use aerobic respiration on fatty acids. And fatty acids, after about 30 minutes of exercise, are the primary source. Which means you have to exercise for 30 minutes before your body does start burning the fat. I'd like to define a couple of terms at this point. So these terms are aerobic endurance and anaerobic threshold. Aerobic endurance is defined as the length of time muscles contract using an aerobic pathway. Using aerobic pathway. And so during light to moderate activity, this can be hours. So if you're a marathon runner, you can run for roughly 3 hours continuously. That would be light to moderate activity using sort of pushing your aerobic endurance. If you're an ultra marathoner, you can do it for 24 or 48 hours. The next term I'd like to define is anaerobic threshold. This is the point at which so much energy is being generated that the aerobic pathways can't keep up, and so you get a conversion from aerobic to anaerobic pathways. Energy production converted from aerobic to anaerobic. So using running as an example, here you can see basically ATP is used for the first 6 seconds. So if you're doing a 100-yard dash, this will probably get you to about 60 meters. or 60 yards. To finish that dash, this will get you, start using creatine phosphate. So that'll get you to the end of the 100-yard dash, probably could get you to about 120 meters if you get to 14, 15 seconds. The next 30 to 40 seconds, you start breaking down glycogen and glucose to make ATP without oxygen. And if you continue at that intensity, you will then exhaust yourself and end the exercise at roughly a minute. So this will get you once around a track, so a 400-meter dash. If you're going to run longer than that, then you have to be dependent on aerobic respiration, and so ATP is generated using oxygen to break down these large macromolecules and generate ATP. Muscle fatigue is the next topic we will be covering. So muscle fatigue is caused by the physiological inability to contract despite continued stimulation, and this is not really dependent on lack of ATP. So other things interfere. So what it is caused by is elevated calcium concentrations, so increased calcium, potassium, I'm doing this backwards, so calcium and phosphate interfere with excitation contraction coupling. With excitation contraction coupling. What also happens if you exercise for too long is that the sarcoplasmic reticulum becomes damaged. And so then that interferes with calcium regulation. Regulation doesn't work. What we will talk about next are the factors affecting muscle contraction. And we've talked through a bunch of these already, which we'll re-mention and have you think through. But at this point, we'll be talking about the length-tension relationship. So the first three factors that influence force of muscle contraction are things that alter the number of cross bridges attached, and these are altered by the number of muscle fibers stimulated, relative size of fibers, and the frequency of stimulation. So what I would like you to do before going on to the next slide is explain how each of these three factors alter the force of contraction. And just as a reminder, or hopefully you've now answered this, number of muscle fibers stimulated is regulated by motor unit recruitment. So the more number of motor units recruited is going to increase the total number of muscle fibers activated, which increases the number of cross bridges being generated and generates more force. As stimulus increases, so this is a size principle. So increased strength of stimulus increases the size of the motor unit or muscle fibers that are being activated, which increases the number of motor units recruited and more force. And then finally wave summation, which increases frequency, means that this doesn't necessarily increase the number of motor unit or cross bridges that are attached, but it does increase, basically remove that relaxation between cross bridges. So now we're ready to talk about the length-tension relationship. So muscle fibers that have optimal overlap, meaning that all of the myosin heads, some optimal overlap. So all myosin heads interacting with actin. That gives you maximum force generation, and this happens when the sarcomeres are at about 80 to 120% normal resting length. And this will make more sense when we see what the other options at the extreme of this are. So when muscle fibers are shortened, so if basically the antagonistic muscle is pulling things too closely together, so this is less than 80% resting length, what you get is interference between the actin filaments. And so when this happens, that interference decreases the amount of force. So here you can see the interference and the amount of force decreasing rapidly as these elements interfere more and more. At the opposite extreme, you get an overstretched sarcomere, in which, so overstretched, which happens when it's greater than 120% of resting length. And so when this happens, it's the myosin heads are not all interacting with actin. So myosin pulled off of actin. And because this is stretching further and further, you can see here's fewer and fewer myosin heads until you get to the point of fully separating those actin and myosin heads, and then no more force is being generated. So our next topic will be talking about changes in velocity and duration of muscle contraction. So rate of muscle contraction and duration are impacted by muscle fiber types that are involved, the load that the muscle is acting on, and then recruitment. So our first topic we'll cover within this area is talking about differences in muscle fiber type. So muscle fibers can be classified based on around two characteristics, the first of which is the speed of contraction. So there are slow and fast fibers, and they are classified based at which the speed at which myosin ATPases split ATP. Or hydrolyze ATP. So if you have a faster ATPase, that's going to give you a faster processing of ATP. If you have a slower ATP, then that's going to slow it down. This is speed of contraction is also impacted by the motor neuron. So pattern of motor neuron stimulation. So if it's a slower motor neuron, it will stimulate it slower. The second factor that classifies muscle fiber type is the metabolic pathways used for ATP. And so there's two options. You can have an oxidative fiber, oxidative fibers, which use aerobic pathways. And then glycolytic pathways, or glycolytic fibers, which use anaerobic pathways. Namely glycolysis. And then this is just showing oxidative on the left, glycolysis on the right. Ultimately, what this gives us is three different fiber types. So we have slow oxidative fibers, which are these darkest fibers here, and they provide slow contractions that are fatigue resistant, but because they're contracting slower, they can't generate quite as much force. The second category of muscle fiber are fast oxidative fibers, and these ones are intermediate. So they use oxygen, so aerobic respiration, but they have fast ATPs. And you can see this here is this intermediate colored fiber, so they're sort of gray colored. And then the final fiber type are fast glycolytic fibers, so they allow for rapid contraction. They fatigue quickly, and they generate lots of force. And these are these white fibers here. And so you can see in this picture is a good illustration that most muscle tissues are made up of different amounts of each of these fiber types. And depending on your biology, sometimes you'll have muscles that are composed of mostly fast glycolytic fibers, whereas somebody else may have the same muscle group, but they could be composed of slow oxidative fibers. And so that would be a slow oxidative fiber muscle that's maybe one of the quadriceps would be something that would be good for a long distance runner. If another runner had fast glycolytic fibers, they would be a better sprinter. The next thing that I'd like to talk about that impacts velocity and duration of muscle contraction is muscle load. So muscles contract fastest when there's no load added. So as you increase the load, it will change both the duration of contraction. So greater load is decreased duration of contraction, which you can see here takes a little bit longer for the contraction to start, and then the contraction ends much earlier if it's a heavy load versus a light load, where you get contraction occurring very rapidly and you can sustain it longer. In addition, greater loads also slow down the rate of contraction. So decreased speed of contraction. And that's shown here where you have velocity on the y-axis, increasing load on the x-axis. And so as load increases, velocity slows down. And so this makes sense as well, because the higher the load, the slower the amount of time, or longer it takes for the amount of force needed to move that load increases. And so this slows down the rate of contraction. The last factor impacting velocity and duration of muscle contraction is motor unit recruitment. And the more motor units you have involved, equals faster and longer contractions. And this is illustrated by this dog sleds, where one dog will pull a lighter weight slower for a shorter amount of time. If you want to go for a very fast long ride, you need a big set of dogs pulling your sled. The last two things I'd like to cover are just the impacts of exercise. So with aerobic or endurance exercises such as jogging, swimming, or biking, what happens is that your muscles will actually increase vascularity, so increase number of capillaries. So you increase your blood supply. It increases the number of mitochondria that are there. And increases the amount of myoglobin, which is the oxygen-carrying pigment in muscles. And so when you do this is basically enhancing your muscles' ability to produce produce ATP using aerobic respiration. And what this results is increased endurance, increased strength because you've got more energy allowed to do that, and increased resistance to fatigue. The last type of exercise, second type of exercise, is resistance exercising. So this would be typically anaerobic and includes weightlifting or isometric exercises, which typically lead to muscle hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy, which means that the muscles are increasing in size. And this is primarily due to muscle fibers increasing in diameter. You also do get more mitochondria, myofilaments, glycogen stores, and more connective tissue. So the first factor. Second factor is increased mitochondria, increased myofilaments, so you're able to generate more force, increased glycogen, so you can generate that force for a little bit longer and recover quicker, and then increased connective tissue. So this is all of those membranes surrounding the muscle will get stronger so that they can resist the force that's being generated. And overall, the result is that you get an increase in muscle strength and size.